I'm Ros Atkins, welcome to Outside Source. Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have held their first face-to-face dialogue since the US president came to office.
I absolutely believe there need not be a new Cold War. I've met many times with Xi Jinping, and we were candid and clear with one another across the board.
The UK will pay France millions of pounds more for increased patrols to prevent people crossing the channel in small boats.
Hello, 2LO calling, 2LO calling.
And the BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official radio broadcast. Hello. Right, let's start with the G20 in Bali in Indonesia. For the first time since he took office, President Biden held face-to-face meetings with China's President Xi Jinping. We heard from both of them. First of all, here's President Biden. Now, let's talk about another issue that Rishi Sunak is paying close attention to, migration. Because today, the UK and France have reached a new deal, and this is aimed at reducing the number of people coming across the English Channel in small boats. We know that more than 40,000 people have already made the crossing this year. That's the highest number on record. And here's the UK's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, speaking earlier. Now, the global population is projected to hit a new all-time high on Tuesday. We're going to go through 8 billion people. The world's population has doubled in less than 50 years, and needless to say, it's still rising. Our medical editor, Fergus Walsh, has more on this. Now, the BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official BBC broadcast, which was a news bulletin from here in London, so we're nothing if not consistent. Our correspondent, David Silito, has more. Well, they're hard acts to follow, but we're doing our best. And if you want more analysis from me and the Outside Source team, when you're not watching us live on the TV, a good place to find our videos are via my Twitter account, at BBC Ros Atkins is where you can follow me. You'll see recent ones there on the World Cup in Qatar and other issues too. At BBC Ros Atkins is where you can find me. But more immediately, I'll be back with you in a couple of minutes' time. I'm Ros Atkins, welcome back to Outside Source. At the G20 in Indonesia, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have had their first face-to-face talks since Mr. Biden became president.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly.
Ukraine's President Zelensky says it's the beginning of the end of the war as he visits the recaptured city of Kherson. And Turkey is blaming Kurdish rebels for an explosion that killed 6 people in central Istanbul. Right, back to our top story, the G20 summit in Bali, because as I was saying, for the first time since he took office, President Biden has had these face-to-face talks with President Xi of China. Here's the moment the two leaders met. There were some smiles, handshaking as you'd expect. This is all on the eve of the summit beginning. G20 stands for Group of 20. Representatives from all 20 will be there, but needless to say, to some degree, the whole thing's being overshadowed by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how that issue is dealt with. Well, President Biden has in the past said that the US is prepared to use force if China were ever to invade Taiwan. On Monday, he stuck with that message. Well, let's talk about the war in Ukraine. President Zelensky has made a surprise visit to Kherson. This is the first visit since we saw that withdrawal of Russian troops last week and Ukrainian troops going in. Here he is, singing the national anthem. hand on the chest. This is in the central square in Kherson with the national anthem playing. Bear in mind, when Russia occupied the city in March, national songs were banned. Even speaking Ukrainian could lead to arrest. That evidently will change now. And this is what President Zelensky said today. Mr. Kamyshin, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you very much indeed for bringing us up to date on Ukrainian railways. So that's Alexander Kamyshin, live on Outside Source, head of Ukrainian railways, saying some of the damage around Kherson may take, he said, up to 10 days to repair, but he hopes that beyond those 10 days, the tracks will be returned to working order. Remember, there's lots more background on the war in Ukraine via the BBC News website. Also, in a few minutes here on Outside Source, we're going to talk about, well, these guys, a group of baby turtles who've been released back to sea in Florida 6 weeks after almost being killed by Hurricane Ian. We'll have their story. I'm Ros Atkins with Outside Source. We're here in the BBC newsroom. Our lead story comes from Bali, the G20 summit. After meeting Xi Jinping, Joe Biden says he's not looking for conflict with China. Now, Turkish and Syrian Kurdish groups have denied any role in a bomb attack in Istanbul on Sunday. 6 people died, 80 others were wounded. Turkey has blamed Kurdish rebels for the attack. This was the moment it happened. Now, here's a story from Florida, because a group of baby turtles who were rescued after almost being killed by Hurricane Ian, which hit Florida around 6 weeks ago, well, they've been released back to the sea. One of the rescued turtles has been given the name Ian, named after the hurricane, of course. Tom Brada has more. That is it for this edition of Outside Source. Thanks as ever for watching. We'll be back very soon. Bye-bye. I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome back to Outside Source. Joe Biden and Xi Jinping have held their first face-to-face talks since Mr. Biden came to office.
We're going to compete vigorously, but I'm not looking for conflict. I'm looking to manage this competition responsibly.
The UK is going to pay France millions of dollars more for increased patrols to prevent people crossing the channel in small boats. And Ukraine's President Zelensky says it's the beginning of the end of the war as he visits the recaptured city of Kherson. Let's start at the G20 summit in Bali in Indonesia, because for the first time since he took office, President Biden has held face-to-face talks with China's President Xi. We heard from both men afterwards. First of all, here's President Biden. Now let's look at another issue Rishi Sunak is focused on: migration. Because today the UK and France have reached a new deal. It's aimed at reducing the number of people who are crossing the English Channel in small boats. Now we know that more than 40,000 people have made this crossing so far this year. That's the highest number on record. And here's the UK's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, talking about the deal that's been done. Now, stay with me here on Outside Source. In a few minutes, we'll talk about this.
Hello. 2LO calling. 2LO calling.
The BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official radio broadcast. I'm Ros Atkins with Outside Source. We're here, as ever, in the BBC newsroom. Next, we're going to turn to Ukraine because President Zelensky has made a surprise visit to Kherson. This is the city where Russian forces withdrew and Ukrainian troops arrived last week. Here is the president singing the national anthem in the city square. Now, police in Turkey have detained a woman who they say planted a bomb in the centre of Istanbul. We know 6 people died when the explosion happened in a crowded street on Sunday. Our Middle East correspondent Anna Foster has more from Istanbul. And there are more details on that attack on the BBC News website. Now, the BBC is celebrating the 100th anniversary of its first official BBC broadcast. It was a news bulletin from here in London, so we're nothing if not consistent. Our correspondent David Silito has more.
Hello. 2LO calling. 2LO calling.
November the 14th, 1922, and the beginning of the BBC. 2LO was the call sign of the BBC station in London. And 100 years on, the 6 o'clock radio news has been marking how it all began.
This bulletin marks the moment 100 years ago that the BBC began broadcasting.
Back in 1922, the newsreader at 6 p.m. was Arthur Burrows.
Arthur Burrows, at this point, is the first voice of the BBC. He's almost had the idea of broadcasting a few years earlier as well. And within a month, he'll be director of programmes at the BBC and one of our first children's presenters.
Yes, Arthur was also Uncle Arthur, children's entertainer. It wasn't a large organisation on day one. How many staff at the beginning in November 1922?
November 1922, the BBC has a staff of 0. There are no employees.
No official staff?
There are no official staff. Arthur Burrows does that first broadcast essentially in his spare time.
Was it just London in November 1922?
No, so London was day 1, and then day 2 was Birmingham and Manchester. And that's where you get musical concerts, children's programmes come in there, the general election results as well, all mixed in together.
For them as likes London, I suppose it's all right.
And the BBC has only now been discovering just how many of its pioneering programmes came from Manchester and Birmingham.
Wherever to you, Birmingham.
It's adding details to its online Radio Times history about satire, concerts. And this is Puppy from the children's programme from Glasgow. But it began with the news, and it was nerve-wracking. Arthur Burrows later wrote he could think of no more exacting a test of physical fitness than the reading of a news bulletin. David Silito, BBC News.
They're a hard act to follow, but we're doing our best. Thank you very much indeed for watching. We'll see you tomorrow at the usual time. Bye-bye.
Hello there. It's remaining cold for this upcoming week across Scandinavia, the Baltic states.